Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Echoes Beyond the Veil. The Brooks family had always lived quietly in their modest home on Elmwood Street. It was the kind of neighborhood where lawns were neatly trimmed, children rode bikes down the sidewalks, and the occasional barbecue brought everyone together. For John Brooks, a man who thrived on routine, the peaceful monotony was comforting. But life has a way of shattering even the calmest of routines. It was a Thursday evening when the phone call came. John had been fixing a leaky pipe in the upstairs bathroom, his hands covered in grime as he wrestled with the rusted fixture. Downstairs, his 7-year-old son, Ethan, sat cross-legged on the carpet, building a fortress out of colorful blocks. Chloe, his 5-year-old daughter, had sprawled out on the couch, her attention glued to an animated movie. Melissa, his wife, had stepped out to visit a neighbor, leaving the children in John's care. When the shrill ring of the telephone cut through the air, none of the children moved. It was an unspoken rule in the house. No one under the age of 12 was allowed to answer the phone. But Ethan, ever the curious and defiant one, shot up from his spot and reached for the receiver.
Ethan, no.
John's voice boomed from the bathroom, but it was too late. Hello? Ethan's small voice carried a mixture of excitement and trepidation. John hurried down the stairs, wiping his hands on his jeans. Give me the phone, he demanded, extending his hand. But Ethan didn't move. He stood frozen, the receiver pressed tightly against his ear. His eyes widened as he listened, and for a moment, the room felt unnaturally still. Ethan, John's voice rose, snapping the boy out of his trance. Ethan hung up the phone abruptly and turned to face his father. Jim says hi, he said simply, his tone matter-of-fact. And he misses Skywing Nova. John's heart skipped a beat. His hands, still damp from the leaky pipe, clenched into fists. What did you just say? He asked, his voice tight. Jim says hi, Ethan repeated, his gaze steady. And he misses Skywing Nova. The name was like a punch to the gut. Skywing Nova wasn't just a random phrase. It was a childhood nickname given to John by his best friend, Jim. The same Jim who had died 7 years ago. Who was on the phone? John asked, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. Ethan shrugged. I don't know. He sounded nice, though. John stared at his son, his mind racing. It wasn't possible. Jim was gone. He had been gone for years, his death a tragic accident that had left a permanent void in John's life. And yet, Ethan had just spoken his name as though it were the most natural thing in the world. That night, John couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events replayed in his mind. Next to him, Melissa slept soundly, unaware of the turmoil brewing within him. The next morning, over breakfast, John decided to bring it up. Ethan, he began, keeping his tone casual. Do you remember the phone call from last night? Ethan nodded, his mouth full of cereal. Can you tell me exactly what the person said? Ethan set his spoon down and thought for a moment. He said, Hi, Ethan. Tell your dad that Jim says hi and he misses Skywing Nova. Then he hung up. John's stomach tightened. And you've never heard the name Skywing Nova before? Ethan shook his head. Nope. What does it mean? It's nothing, John said quickly, though his son's innocent curiosity gnawed at him. Over the next few days, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He began scrutinizing every detail of the household, the faint creak of the floorboards at night, the way the wind rattled the windows, the occasional static crackle on the radio. Things he had once dismissed as mundane now felt heavy with meaning. The phone calls didn't stop. They always came at odd hours, late at night or early in the morning when the house was still. Each time, the caller hung up before John could answer. On one occasion, he picked up just in time to hear a faint whisper, Help me. The voice was unmistakably Jim's. John's nights grew restless. He found himself waking up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, the echo of Jim's voice lingering in his ears. He began having vivid dreams, memories of their childhood adventures, of the camping trips they used to take, of the day Jim had held Ethan for the first time just weeks before his death. "Are you okay?" Melissa asked one morning, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. "Just tired," John muttered, avoiding her gaze. But the truth was he was unraveling. He started going through old photo albums, pulling out anything that reminded him of Jim. One evening, he found a dusty shoebox tucked away in the attic. Inside were letters, postcards, and a faded Polaroid of the two of them standing in front of a campfire. On the back of the photograph, written in Jim's handwriting, were the words, "Friends Forever, Skywing Nova." John stared at the photo, a lump forming in his throat. The memories were bittersweet, a reminder of what he had lost. But they also raised a chilling question. Why now? Why, after all these years? Was Jim reaching out? Determined to find answers, John began piecing together the timeline of Jim's death. He reached out to old friends, searching for any details he might have missed. One conversation stood out. "Did Jim ever mention anything strange before he died?" John asked an old college buddy over the phone. There was a long pause. "You know," the friend said slowly, "he did seem off the last few weeks. He said he felt like someone was watching him. I thought he was just being paranoid. But now what? Now I'm not so sure." The conversation left John with more questions than answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jim's death hadn't been as straightforward as it seemed. As the days turned into weeks, the Brooks household became a place of unease. Melissa began noticing the tension in John and the way Ethan would sometimes stare at empty corners of the room. The phone calls continued, each one more unnerving than the loss. John receives another call. This time he picks up, determined to confront whoever or whatever is on the other end. For a moment, there's only static. Then, a familiar voice speaks. "Find me." The line goes dead. John sat in the darkened living room, the glow of the phone's receiver still clutched in his hand. The voice echoed in his mind. "Find me." It was unmistakably Jim's, low and familiar, the way he used to speak when they stayed up late talking about life and dreams. Melissa came downstairs, startled to find her husband wide awake in the middle of the night. "John, what are you doing?" she asked, wrapping her robe tighter around her. "I need to figure this out," he muttered, his voice thick with determination. "I think Jim is trying to tell me something." Melissa frowned. "John, you're exhausted. You haven't been sleeping, and now you're chasing shadows. Maybe it's just stress, or your mind playing tricks on you." But John wasn't listening. He had already decided on his next step. The following morning, he took a day off work and headed to the public library. He spent hours combing through old newspapers, looking for anything related to Jim's death. The accident had been ruled as a single-car crash, a tragic miscalculation on a winding road late at night. No foul play was suspected at the time. Still, something didn't sit right with John. The police report had described Jim's behavior as erratic in the days leading up to his death. Witnesses claimed he seemed distracted, even paranoid. One account mentioned Jim muttering about needing to fix things before it was too late. John scribbled notes in his journal, his mind racing with possibilities. What had Jim meant? And why had he chosen now, years later, to reach out? Back at home, Ethan's behavior had started to change. He was quieter than usual, often staring off into space or talking to himself in hushed tones. Melissa noticed it first. "Ethan, who are you talking to?" she asked one afternoon, catching him in the hallway. "Nobody," he replied quickly, avoiding her gaze. But Melissa wasn't convinced. She began paying closer attention, and what she saw left her unnerved. Ethan would sit in his room for hours, his toys untouched, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. One evening, as she stood outside his bedroom door, she heard him say, "I'll tell him, I promise." The hairs on her arms stood on end. John's investigation took a turn when he decided to revisit the crash site. It was a desolate stretch of road on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. He parked his car and walked along the shoulder, scanning the area for anything that might have been overlooked. It didn't take long for him to find it. Hidden in the underbrush, partially buried beneath years of dirt and leaves, was a rusted metal box. His heart pounded as he pried it open, revealing a stack of faded photographs and a small notebook. The photographs were mostly of Jim and John in their younger days, laughing, hiking, and camping. But the notebook was what caught John's attention. It was filled with frantic scribbles, pages upon pages of notes that seemed to detail Jim's growing paranoia. One entry, dated just days before his death, stood out. "I can't shake the feeling that someone is following me. I see shadows where there shouldn't be any. And the dreams, they're getting worse. If anything happens to me, I hope John finds this. He'll know what to do." John's breath caught in his throat. What dreams? And what did Jim mean by knows what to do? That night, John shared his findings with Melissa. She listened, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "John, this is unsettling," she admitted. "But what are you hoping to find? Jim is gone. You can't bring him back." "I don't know," John confessed. "But I can't ignore this. He wanted me to find that box. He wanted me to understand something." As they spoke, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. They bolted out of their chairs and raced to the source of the noise. Ethan's room was in disarray. His bookshelf had toppled over, scattering books and toys across the floor. In the center of the chaos, Ethan stood perfectly still, his face pale. "What happened?" Melissa asked, pulling him into her arms. "I don't know," Ethan whispered. "He got mad." "Who got mad?" John demanded, his voice shaking. Ethan hesitated before answering. "The man on the phone." The next few days were a blur of tension and unease. The phone calls continued, but now they were accompanied by other strange occurrences. Lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own, and the distinct feeling of being watched. John began keeping a journal of everything that happened, desperate to find a pattern or a clue. One night, as he reviewed his notes, he noticed something chilling. Every incident seemed to occur at the same time, 3 a.m. He set an alarm for 2:55 a.m. and waited in the living room, determined to catch whatever or whoever was causing the disturbances. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made every creak and groan of the old wooden floorboards feel deafening. At exactly 3 a.m., the phone rang. John's heart pounded as he picked up the receiver. "Hello." There was a pause, then the same familiar voice. "John, you need to listen to me. Time is running out." "Jim." John's voice cracked. "What do you mean? What's happening?" But the line went dead. By now, Melissa was at her wit's end. "John, we can't keep living like this," she said, her voice trembling. "We need help." Reluctantly, John agreed. He reached out to a local historian who specialized in paranormal cases, hoping for some logical explanation. The man, a stoic figure named Daniel Graves, agreed to meet with them. Daniel listened carefully as John recounted the events, his expression unreadable. When John finished, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, "It sounds like your friend has unfinished business. If he's reaching out to you, it means he trusts you to help him." "But how?" John asked, frustrated. "I don't even know what he wants." Daniel studied the notebook John had found. "Sometimes the dead leave breadcrumbs," he said. "We just have to follow them." Armed with Daniel's advice, John decided to retrace Jim's final days, hoping to uncover the truth. He planned to visit the places Jim had frequented before his death, starting with his old apartment. As he stood outside the building, a sense of foreboding washed over him. The air felt heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Inside, the apartment was exactly as Jim had left it, dusty, cluttered, and filled with memories. But as John searched the rooms, he felt a presence. In the corner of the bedroom, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It didn't move or make a sound, but John could feel its eyes on him. "Jim," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, and for a brief moment, John thought he saw a faint smile. Then it vanished. John leaned against the wall of Jim's old apartment, the air thick with the smell of mildew and neglect. The fleeting figure he had seen moments earlier was gone, yet the weight of its presence lingered. He couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching him. He stepped out into the hallway, breathing heavily, trying to calm his racing thoughts. "It's just stress," he told himself. "You're letting the situation get to you." But deep down, he knew that explanation didn't feel right. John decided to leave the building for now, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. As he exited, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Melissa. "John, where are you?" "Ethan's acting strange again," she said, her voice trembling. "What happened?" he asked, dread tightening his chest. "He keeps saying the same thing over and over. The answers are in the house." John gripped the phone tightly. "What house?" "He won't say." When John returned home, he found Ethan sitting cross-legged in the living room, staring intently at the floor. His brother and sister were nowhere to be seen, likely upstairs in their rooms. Melissa stood nearby, her arms crossed, clearly uneasy. "Ethan," John said softly, kneeling in front of his son. "What house are you talking about?" Ethan lifted his gaze, his eyes distant and unfocused. "The house where it started. That's what he told me." "Who told you?" "The man on the phone," Ethan replied simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. John exchanged a worried glance with Melissa. He crouched closer to Ethan. "Can you show me where this house is?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Following Ethan's directions, John drove his family out of town, to a rural area dotted with overgrown fields and dilapidated barns. The drive was tense, the only sound the hum of the car engine and Melissa's nervous tapping on the dashboard. Finally, Ethan pointed to a gravel driveway barely visible through the weeds. "There," he said. John pulled in, the tires crunching against the gravel. At the end of the driveway stood an old farmhouse, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt alive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for them to arrive. Melissa gripped John's arm. "Are you sure about this?" "No," he admitted. "But I need to know what's going on." The inside of the farmhouse was worse than the exterior, dark, damp, and filled with the stench of decay. Broken furniture and yellowed newspapers were scattered across the floor. Cobwebs hung in thick sheets from the ceiling. Ethan walked confidently, leading them through the house as if he'd been there before. He stopped in the kitchen and pointed to a trapdoor in the floor. "Down there," he said. John hesitated. The trapdoor was locked with a rusty padlock. He found an old hammer in one of the drawers and smashed the lock open. The trapdoor creaked as he lifted it, revealing a set of rickety wooden stairs leading into darkness. "Stay up here with the kids," John told Melissa, his voice firm. "I don't think you should go down there alone," she protested. "I'll be fine," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. John descended the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was cold and damp, with walls made of crumbling stone. As he explored, he noticed something odd. A series of photographs pinned to the wall. They were old, black-and-white photos of people he didn't recognize, farmers, children, and families, all staring blankly at the camera. But one photo made his blood run cold. It was of Jim. In the photo, Jim stood in front of the farmhouse, holding a shovel. His expression was serious, almost grim. Beneath the photos was a large wooden chest, its surface scarred and weathered. John hesitated before opening it, his heart pounding. Inside, he found a collection of items: a journal, a rusted knife, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. He flipped through the journal, his hands trembling. The entries were written in Jim's handwriting, but they were erratic and difficult to read. One entry stood out. "I did what I had to do. I buried it where no one would find it. But now it's calling to me. I hear it at night whispering my name. John returned upstairs, pale and shaken. He showed Melissa the journal and read the entry aloud. What do you think he buried? Melissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, John admitted. But whatever it is, I think it's the reason all of this is happening. Ethan tugged on his sleeve. It's outside, he said. What's outside? The place where he buried it. John and Melissa exchanged a look. Together, they followed Ethan outside, where he led them to a patch of ground behind the farmhouse. The soil looked disturbed, as though it had been dug up and refilled recently, despite the years of abandonment. John retrieved a shovel from the barn and began digging. The further he dug, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an unexplainable energy. Finally, the blade of the shovel struck something solid. He knelt down and brushed away the dirt, revealing a metal box similar to the one he had found near the crash site. John pried the box open, revealing its contents. A blood-stained cloth, a pocket knife, and a small, leather-bound notebook. The notebook's first page was blank, but the second contained a single sentence written in bold, shaky letters. You shouldn't have come here. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment, John thought he heard a voice, low and guttural, whisper his name. John sat in the farmhouse's barren kitchen, the cold notebook in his trembling hands. Melissa stood beside him, her face pale and tense. Outside, Ethan and his siblings waited in the car under Melissa's watchful eye. She had insisted on removing the children from whatever this was, sensing the danger of lingering too long. What does this mean? Melissa asked, nodding toward the notebook. It means, John said slowly, his voice steadying as he spoke, that Jim was involved in something terrible, and whatever it was, it's been waiting for someone to find it. John flipped through the notebook again, each page filled with scrawled, cryptic entries. Most of them seemed like ramblings, mentions of voices, warnings, and guilt. But one entry caught his eye. The farmhouse wasn't mine. I only kept what was left behind. But the land remembers. It won't forget. It won't let me go. John packed the notebook carefully into his bag. As they drove back home, the air in the car was thick with tension. Ethan stared silently out the window, his face unreadable. Melissa kept glancing at him, then at John, as though trying to piece together her own understanding of what was happening. What are you going to do? Melissa finally asked. I don't know yet, John admitted. But I need to figure out what Jim was hiding. I owe him that much. Back at home, John spread out the notebook, the photographs, and the journal on the dining table. Melissa stood by, watching him piece together the fragments of Jim's life. There has to be a reason he kept these things, John muttered. He sifted through the photographs, focusing on the ones taken at the farmhouse. In one, Jim stood beside an older man, a tall figure with a stern expression and piercing eyes. Do you recognize him? Melissa asked. John shook his head. No, but I think he might have been the previous owner of the farmhouse. Melissa leaned in closer, studying the photograph. What if he's the key to all of this? Determined to uncover the truth, John spent the following day at the local archives. The building was dimly lit and smelled faintly of dust, the shelves lined with yellowed records and brittle newspapers. He started with property records, tracing the ownership of the farmhouse. The last recorded owner before Jim was a man named Albert Kane, who had died under mysterious circumstances nearly 50 years ago. John's heart raced as he dug further, finding old newspaper clippings about Kane's death. One headline stood out: Farmer found dead in apparent suicide. Questions linger about missing children. The article detailed a series of disappearances in the area around the time of Kane's death. Several local children had vanished, and though no evidence was ever found, rumors suggested Kane was involved. John returned home with copies of the articles, his mind reeling. He sat with Melissa, going over everything. This doesn't make sense, Melissa said. Why would Jim have taken over that house, knowing its history? I think he didn't know at first, John said. But once he found out, Maybe he tried to fix things. Maybe that's why he buried the box. Melissa frowned. Fix things? How? John didn't answer. His gaze fell to the photograph of Jim and Albert Kane. Something about it nagged at him. He picked up the photo, flipping it over. Scrawled on the back were the words, "Never forget, protect the living." That night, John woke to the sound of soft whispers. At first, he thought it was the wind. But as he sat up in bed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. He followed the sound downstairs, finding Ethan sitting at the dining table, staring at the notebook. "Ethan, what are you doing?" John asked, his voice hoarse. Ethan didn't look up. "He wants you to know the truth," he said softly. "Who?" "The man in the picture," Ethan said. "He says you're not listening." John felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at the notebook, its pages open to an entry he hadn't seen before. The words were scrawled in large, frantic handwriting. "The land will take what it's owed. Run while you can." Determined to end this, John returned to the farmhouse the next morning. This time, he brought tools to dig deeper into the property. He began searching the grounds, focusing on areas that looked recently disturbed. Hours passed, and John was about to give up when his shovel struck something hard. He unearthed a small, rusted metal box similar to the one he had found before. Inside was a stack of faded photographs and a journal belonging to Albert Kane. The journal revealed the horrific truth. Kane had been involved in the disappearances of the local children. He had buried their remains on the property to hide his crimes. The land, steeped in tragedy, had become a symbol of his guilt. Jim had discovered this years later and tried to make amends by reburying the evidence, hoping to put the past to rest. But the weight of what had happened there lingered, refusing to be forgotten. John returned home, exhausted and haunted by what he had uncovered. He sat with Melissa, explaining everything. "We can't let this stay buried," John said. "The families of those children deserve to know the truth." Melissa nodded, though her face was pale. "And what about us? What about Ethan?"
John sighed.
"I don't know. But I think this will stop once the truth comes out." John contacted the authorities, providing them with the evidence he had found. The farmhouse was soon swarming with police and forensic teams, unearthing what remained of Kane's terrible legacy. As the story broke in the news, John and his family tried to return to normalcy. But the experience left its mark on all of them. One night, as John tucked Ethan into bed, his son looked up at him and said, "He's gone now. The man in the picture. He says thank you." John felt a lump in his throat but managed a small smile. "Good. Maybe now we can all move on." The farmhouse was eventually demolished, the land left untouched as a memorial to the lives lost. Though the nightmares faded with time, John often thought about Jim and the burden he had carried. In the end, John realized that some truths, no matter how dark, needed to be unearthed. Not for the sake of the past, but to protect the future.